Okay, we're ready to begin. So I'm going to take my folder and drag it into my code editor of choice, text expander in this case, and we have our index.html file. Don't worry about this folder, this is actually just for my recording the screencast. So we're going to begin here, and we're going to start with this basic structure. Now, many people ask me, how do you assign snippets of code to keystrokes? Many editors have some built in, but I've found that the widespread way to use it is to use a text expander program. So for Mac, the most popular one is called Text Expander. For PC, there's actually a free alternative called Texter. It's not quite as good, but it's 100% free, so be sure to check that out. What's nice about Text Expander is I can take anything from an email signature to a long string of HTML like this, and I can assign it to any key code I want. In this case, I have that assigned to begin HTML, and if I hit the tab, it'll trigger that expansion, as you can see there. If I want to add maybe some generic text, like the lorem text, I can type lorem, and that'll be expanded. It's really helpful. It saved me 100 hours or so in the last year. I do recommend that you, it isn't free, I believe it's around $39, so don't feel like you have to buy it, but I guarantee that it's going to save you a lot of time if you're on the computer a lot. Even if you're just emailing people, I use it all the time. Okay, so let's get back into it. We're using the kind of an HTML5 optimized markup. So if this isn't familiar to you, maybe if your doc type looks a little different than mine, your meta types are a little longer, that's okay. But this is kind of the best practice now. We're beginning to embrace HTML5, and these are all things that we can do without having to worry about any browser inconsistencies. Now, if you're brand new to HTML, you're just getting started, this may actually be what you're using by default, and if so, that's really nice for you, because even a couple years ago, we had to use these really long doc types that you can never remember. Let's see if we have one here. If I can remember what the shortcut is. Yeah, you can see here, this is even not that long ago I was using this, and it's just so long, but now we can just replace that with doc type HTML. The same holds true for like meta. This is much shorter than it used to be. Mostly don't worry about this, just know this is what I do recommend that you use for your base markup. Okay, so now what you signed up for, let's get into the CSS. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to create a div, a division, and we're going to give it an ID of content, anything arbitrary like that. And within here, we can just paste anything we want. We'll just write hello world. All right, so let's go into Firefox and refresh the page, and now we're going to take advantage of that web developer toolbar that I told you about in the last entry. So I'll go to CSS, edit CSS, or on the Mac I can hit Shift-Command-E. By the way, this is also available in PC. It's just an extension for Firefox. So the very first thing I want to teach you about is just the standard width, height, things like that. So the basic syntax for CSS is you find the element. So in this case where we have, let me pull that over here. You see where we have a div with an ID of content. To target all divs, meaning as many divs as we have on the page, I simply type the name of the element, div. Then we do open curly brace, close curly braces, and any properties contained within these braces will be bound to that element. So in this case, I'm setting the color of all divs to red. Now this would apply, as I said before, if I add 10 more. If I were to copy this, if I had a div, anything like this, this would also receive that styling. Now, what we do in here is we specify a property and a value. And we can do as many of these as we want, but just note that you set your property followed by a colon and then the value, and then to designate that it's the end of your statement, kind of similar to the way JavaScript works, or PHP or tons of programming languages. We use a semicolon, and that just means that's it for this statement. And I can add another one if I want. Don't worry about these properties. We're going to go over all of them, but just to give you a basic idea. Div. Now, what if I want to target something specifically? How can we do that? So let's go back to TextMate, and I'm going to add another div, as I did previously. Hello again. And I'm going to refresh the page. And you can see here that we're targeting both the divs as I showed you. But what if you only want to target one specific division? And that's where IDs and classes come into play. So you can see here I've set an ID equal to content. And what this does is it's literally an identification, something that will allow us to target that specific element. Any HTML tag, you call it an element. It allows us to target that uniquely and not anything else. So the way with CSS that we can target IDs is we first use the pound symbol, and that just means ID, element with an ID. And now we type in the name of the ID, content. So pound content means find the element in the markup that has an ID of content. ID of content. And now you can see we are targeting only that element and not the other one. Really nice, really helpful. Now we also have something called classes. Div class equals, it can be anything. Main, I don't know, it could be anything. It could be header, it could be main content. Now the difference between IDs and classes, you could give it a class of emphasis. Let's do that. Is that an ID is if you want to target one specific element on the page. We cannot apply more IDs, so I couldn't do another div ID with the content. Now, truthfully, technically, I can get away with that. The page will still render appropriately, and the browsers will be smart enough. However, this is invalid code. This is bad markup. Only apply one ID once. Otherwise, it kind of defeats the purpose of it. So let's come back. Now, a class is different. A class is if you want to apply to any number of elements and give it some kind of styling. So we'll note that we don't want to give something a class of red or something specific like that. Because let's say we go here. Now the way to target classes, with IDs we did pound. However, with classes we do period. So if I did class red, color is red, and let's save that. You can see that both of them are turning red. However, what happens if maybe you're working for a client and the client says, you know what, why don't we make that text green? Okay, well, we could go color green, and that'll work. But then it doesn't make any sense. It's not semantic. And semantics mean, look, we have a class of red now, but the color has nothing to do with it. It doesn't make any sense. So always with your classes and your IDs, don't give it a name of styling or anything like that. Give it what it does. Is it the content? Is it the header? Is it the footer of the page? Is it a sidebar? Is it a call out? Is it something to provide emphasis? Anything like that, but don't say bold text or red color. Never ever do that. So in this case, this could be anything, class, like I said, emphasis or quotes. Maybe if we had a section in here for quotes, you can do anything. And the advantage here is anything with the class of quotes, or whatever we call it, will receive that styling. So it can be very helpful. Don't worry about that too much. You'll understand it more and more as we go into this series. For now, just note that the difference is with IDs, we use the pound sign followed by the name of the ID, and with classes, we use a period followed by the class name. All right, so I'm going to get rid of that, and we're going to stick with div with an ID of content. Now, we have tons of properties available to us, and I'm not going to show you every single one ever, but I'm going to show you the ones that you use most often. I'm going to save that, refresh the page, and we're ready to get started. So, a div is just a way, the way I learned it, and it really helped me when I finally understood what is a div actually. Think of a div as a bucket. So let's say we have a lot of things in our bucket and we want to move them maybe to the right side of the page. Well, you could manually take each item out of the bucket, go to the right side of the page and take it out, or you could pick up the bucket or the div and move the div itself. Makes a lot more sense that way, doesn't it? So we can also apply widths and height, a width and a height, anything we want. So this div is going to be a width of anything arbitrary, 300 pixels. Okay, so you're not going to see anything on the page, and why is that? A couple of reasons. One, we're not taking up all of that space, so why don't we apply a background color to only this element? So we have a couple options here. We can type background and anything. We can apply a hex value. A hex value is just a, you know what, we're not going to get into that. Just know that you can apply any color that you want. Okay, red. And now you can see that that background covers the entire width that we've set. So if I were to remove that, what would it do? It takes up all the space. Now this is a little bit beyond what you're ready for, but just note that at a higher level, divs are known as block level elements. And what block level elements do is they will take up all the space available within their container. Okay, so here it doesn't have a container. Its container is the browser window, the body. So it just takes up the entire thing. But don't worry if that's a little confusing, we'll get to that. Let's go back to setting a width of 300 pixels. And if we want, we can also set a height of 300 pixels. So remember, we're setting a property, colon, and a value, and we're ending that with a semicolon. So what happens if I got rid of the semicolon? You can see that the CSS interpreter gets confused and it doesn't understand where the end of the statement is. So it just sets the width. It doesn't set anything, actually. So if that ever happens to you, make sure that you're checking all of this. So now that we have a div, we've set a background color of red, we've set a width and a height. Okay, so you've learned 3 new properties. Let's learn some more. Borders. What if we have our nice little box, and I'm going to set it to more of a kind of a grayish color so it doesn't hurt our eyes. What if we want to apply a border around our box? Okay, well, I can set border. That's the nice thing about CSS. It's very easy. If you want to apply a border, then you use the border property. If you want to apply a background, you use the background property. And border, we can't just say red. It wants to know, okay, well, red, well, how large should the border be? We haven't told it that, so it doesn't understand what to do. So we can tell it, let's set the border to, just for this example, 10 pixels wide. Every edge of the border will be 10 pixels in width. And do we want it to be a solid border? Do we want it to be a dotted border? Do we want it to be a dashed border? You can do any of these. Let's set solid. And we're going to set it to red just so it's easy to see. So now you can see that we've applied a border all around it. If we want to expand this, we can set it to 50, something huge. Most of the time, though, you'll see 1 pixel will do. And you just want something subtle, and maybe usually something that's just a slightly darker shade of your background. Let's go with maybe 666. Okay, and now we have a nice border. So in addition to solid, we have a variety of different borders. We can set dotted. Now, do note that some really old browsers, you're not really going to have to worry about this in new browsers, get a little confused when you use these. But in general, I don't worry about it. And you can see that we have dots now. We can set dashed, and those look like dashes. Okay. Truthfully, though, most of the time, people use solid. It just seems like the default. Okay, so this works well, but notice now that our hello world is right up against that top edge. That doesn't really look nice. So what can we do there? Okay, we have a couple options. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to return to TextMate, and I'm going to replace this with a paragraph tag. And within here, we're just going to expand it, and all this is just that lorem text. Okay, so I'm going to go to View, Hide Project Drawer, so we have a little more room to work with. Okay, so div, and now we have a paragraph tag and some generic text. Okay, so notice how because we've set this width, the text within it is also conforming to the width of its parent element. So if I get rid of width, it's going to take up all that space again. So we'll keep it like that. And now we want to give some breathing room around this text so that it's not so close up. So you have a couple options. The first thing I want to show you here, though, and this is something that really confused me, so try to pay attention. I'm going to set a display ruler and let's measure. Now we already know how wide this is, but let's just make sure. Okay, we can see, whoops, let's do that again. We can see that it's roughly 300 pixels. 295, I was a little short, but it is 300 pixels. So we can use the property called padding. And padding is think of padding as breathing room. Padding, and we're going to set 20 pixels. Okay, so that seemingly fixes it. Now our text has a lot of breathing room. But did you notice that now the width of our element or our div is much bigger now? It's 337. Actually, it's 340, but I'm not measuring right. There we go, 340. Why is that? We have a width set of 300, so why is, when we added padding, did it suddenly change? And it's because that padding is added to the width of the page, and this was actually caused for some issues in older browsers, like Internet Explorer. But just know when you add padding, you're going to actually, not in every circumstances, but in these cases, the padding is going to increase the width of your element. Now, why is it 340? And it's because we've added 20 pixels of padding all around. 20 pixels on the top, 20 pixels on the right, 20 pixels on the bottom, and 20 pixels on the left. So we actually have a form where we can actually do 4 values. So we could do 10 pixels, 5 pixels, 50 pixels, just to give you the example. And now you can see it goes top, right, bottom, left, like a clock. 20 on the top, 10 on the right, 5 on the bottom, 50 on the left. So I'm going to change that because all I need when I do one single value is all around for every single one. So because there's 20 on the left and 20 on the right, that's 40. 40 plus 300 is 340. Now this makes a problem, especially if you're building a very pixel-specific website. You may not have the ability to just, oh, it's okay if it's larger. It needs to be 300 pixels. So what do you do in those cases? You have a couple options. One of them is to think ahead and change your width accordingly. So 260, bring it down 40 pixels. That way, when we apply 20 pixels of padding to the left and right, then it'll equal to 300 and you have your padding. That's one way. Another way is don't apply padding to the parent element. So what do I mean by the parent element? The parent element, in this case, is the div. And then it has children elements. So we could apply another div here. And now this div right here would be a child of this div. So this is the parent, this is the child. That's what I mean. Save that and come back. So what we can do is never, or not never, but not apply padding to the parent element and instead apply the padding to the child element, in this case P. So I could then go, how do I select, we could select all P's we've learned by just typing the element name. And that'll work in this case. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the ruler. Whoops. Okay, and if I set padding 20 pixels, there you go. That's working. The width of this element is still 300 pixels. Problem solved. But remember, this is going to apply to every single paragraph on the page. Every single one, even when you write maybe a blog posting. So how do we specify that? No, we only want to apply this padding to the content element. Only that element's children should receive that. And the way, remember, cascading style sheets, CSS. So we can say content and then space P. So what this means is find all paragraph tags that are within the element with an ID of content. And now that will target it exclusively. So if I do another one, outside of content, save, you'll see, and you know what, you're not even really going to be able to tell, but if we were to do color green, you'll see that that text will only be applied to this ID. Okay? This one is not a child of any ID called content, so it's not applied. If we were to only do the tag name, it would all be applied. So always remember, be as specific as you need to. Let's go back a couple steps. So now you've learned about width, height, background, border, and padding. You've learned a lot, and these are really easy to remember. So the next step is, what about margins? So you see how this element right up here is in the top left corner? What if, to be random, what if we wanted to push it away from the edge of the window, maybe 200 pixels? Maybe our project requires that. How can we do that? And we use it, we have a couple ways actually, but the most common way would be to use margins. So if I go back to content and I set margin, and I could set a value, just like with padding, I can set 50 pixels, 10 pixels, 30 pixels, 300 pixels. That will be top margin up here, that's 50 pixels, 10 on the right, 30 on the left, and 300 30 on the bottom and 300 from the left. And if you need to measure this, you can always do it if it's easier for you, just to measure how far it is. And you can see here, it's 300 pixels. So that's really helpful. Now, alternatively, and this is also true with padding, is rather than, if we only need to adjust maybe the margins on the left, I can say margin dash left. Now this is only going to style one side of the margin. And let's set something big just to easily see, 300 pixels. And now it's pushed that all the way through, really helpful. So at the same time, let's say if you set margin right to 100 pixels, you're not going to see anything. Why is that? And it's because we set a margin right, but there's all this space here, so there's nothing for you to actually see. Always keep that in mind. Now, if we did set it to margin top, it will push it from the top down. This confused a lot of people when I was teaching my last lesson on new CSS, is they didn't understand why margin top made it go down. And I guess that's understandable. Why, if you set a top value, is it going down? And always think of it as pushing. So when you set margin top, we are pushing from the top down. If we set margin left, we are pushing from the left towards the right. A little easier to think of in that way. Okay, so let's save that, and we're going to come back to Text Expander, and I can go ahead and get rid of this new paragraph. So we've edited our CSS here, but how do we apply it to our project? And you have a couple ways. One, which is considered a best practice, is always to use external style sheets. So we can do that right now. New file, and we can call it anything we want, but we have to make sure that the extension is CSS. The browser needs that. So we'll set it to style.css, and I can paste that in there. Save it. And now we've created this new external style sheet, but we haven't told this page anything about that, so it's not going to, by default, display it. We need to tell it, and we can use a link tag for that. We can say link, and notice I'm placing this within the head tag. Link rel equals style sheet. The relationship is a style sheet, and the href is going to be style.css. Okay, refresh the page, and now it's taking effect. Note that if we wanted to create a new folder, maybe new folder CSS, that way we can organize things as best as possible, this isn't going to work anymore. And that's because you got to make sure that you do the correct path. In this case, we first go into the CSS folder and then look for style.css. Save it, refresh the page, and now it's taking effect. Now, this is a best practice in any website that you build. I want you to be doing that. However, if you're ever just doing maybe something simple, maybe you're testing, trying to learn something, you don't have to go to the huge process of creating a new page. You can actually just create style tags. Okay. And let's say body. We're going to get the body element, and this is the parent element, and we're going to set the background to red, just to make it easy. Refresh the page, and that's taking effect too. So if you're doing a small project or just working and learning, it's okay. Just put your style right up here. That's okay. Nobody's going to hurt you. Now, something I don't recommend, and this is what people did way back in the 90s and even the early 2000s, is they would put the styling inline. Save that, come back, and they would do div or body, and they would do style equals background red. You probably have seen this before, and this is really, really bad. And the reason is, imagine there are things called separation of presentation from content from logic. Presentation is how it looks, the style, the layout. Content is the markup. And you never want to combine them two for a mixture of reasons. One, what if one designer on one worker on a team is responsible for the markup and somebody else entirely is responsible for the design? By combining the two, you can't really switch them up, can you? Another one is it makes for really, really sloppy code. It makes for duplicated code. Remember how we learned about classes, that you could take a certain block of styling and apply it to any number of classes. That's really helpful. Well, with this method, you can't do that. You'd have to rewrite it every single time, and that's not a good idea at all. So you can do it this way, but I don't want you to ever do that unless you're just doing a quick test and you need to see if something works. But always move these out either to the head tag if you're doing a small project, or if you're deploying a full application, move them into its own style sheet. And you can even have multiple style sheets if you'd like to separate one for typography, one for layout, one for maybe the blog, anything like that. And we can talk about the pros and cons of that in the future. And that's going to do it for this second lesson, so that you've learned a lot so far. Really, you've learned a lot. You've learned width, height, background, the border property. You've learned margins and how to specify margin for top, right, bottom, left, top, right, bottom, left. You've learned that you can just set a single value and that will apply to all of them. And note that this holds true for padding as well. 50 pixels, that would be padding top, right, bottom, left. Or if we need to be more specific, we can just do padding dash left or top, and then uniquely apply that to only the top of the padding or only the top of the margins. Okay? You've learned about creating external style sheets. You've learned a lot. So take a moment, play with this, let it all in, and if you fully grasp this, then you get to move to the next lesson. Thanks for watching.